One thing I've noticed, and I'm sure you'll have noticed it too, is that when conversations, and particularly these things we call debates, happen here on YouTube, is that they often follow a structure which is kind of familiar. And I think this borrows from a metaphor in which debate is understood as a kind of warfare. You'll have heard people talk about defending their positions, or attacking the defences of the opposition, or trying to undermine the opposition, or maybe completely destroying the opposition. The metaphor of warfare, one side pitted against another in an all-out competition, is prevalent. There's no sense of there being a collaborative act, there's no sense of people trying to build something collectively, there's no sense of taking the position of the other and all those kind of things. The dominant metaphor is one of warfare. Now that's kind of fine, as long as both sides are in agreement that that's how it works, that's how debating societies work, that's how debates often do work, with clear winners and losers and no sense of third ways being produced. That's absolutely fine. There are some potential problems with it though. The first potential problem is when someone who is adopting the warfare metaphor meets someone else who is not adopting the warfare metaphor. For example, if you're using the warfare metaphor to structure your conversation, to structure your relationship, you will very rarely, if ever, say, I don't know. Because if you're in a warfare metaphor strategy, saying I don't know represents a weakness in your defensive argument. It represents a gap in the wall of knowledge that you're trying to present for the opposition. It represents a hole out of which your entire argumentation might leak forth. So you would never say, I don't know. It was a sign of weakness apart from anything else, a sign of personal weakness perhaps. If you're not using the warfare metaphor though, if you're using another metaphor, perhaps one drawn from something like raising a barn or performing a dance or taking part in a relay race, and there's plenty of other metaphors like that. If you're not using the warfare metaphor, then you might well say, I don't know. And in that context, I don't know isn't a sign of weakness. It's the indication of a space into which people can draw their attention collectively to try to see what can be done with this unknown. It's a good thing in other metaphors, but in a warfare metaphor to say, I don't know, is a bad thing. So one potential problem is when someone using a warfare metaphor meets someone else who is using, let's say, a barn raising or a relay race metaphor. What seems to happen in those situations is a complete talking past one another. Their tasks, their roles, their occupation of this debate, whilst it appears to be parallel, is actually dislocated. They're not playing the same game, they're operating in different metaphors. And if you want an example of that, there's quite a nice discussion between a gentleman called Jason Peters, who is a presuppositionalist Christian, or a Christian who uses the presuppositionalist argument, and a gentleman called Philosophy Vlogs. I don't know his religious affiliation, if any. But in that particular discussion that I'm thinking of, and I'll put the link below, the discussion, regardless of the content, the discussion is clearly one which is foundering because there are different understandings of what is going on in terms of that interaction. Jason Peters, or Jason Peterson perhaps, is adopting a warfare strategy in which you try to undermine, try to find faults and failures in your opposition's arguments such that you can exploit them and destroy them. Whereas Philosophy Vlog's approach is one of open admission that person doesn't know things, an invitation to try to build. Now I want to stress I'm not privileging one over the other. I have my own personal preferences, but both have validity, both are useful strategies. But when they meet in that kind of environment, they tend to produce rather odd clashes and results. And what usually happens, as happened in that case, is that both parties retreat and victory is claimed for both sides, because in their terms, in the terms of the kind of argumentation strategy that's been deployed, they're seeking different aims, and they've probably both satisfied their aims to some degree, better than their perceived opposite number or opponent or the person they're speaking to. The other potential problem, this is more cogent or in terms of particular kinds of discussions on YouTube, is when people do adopt the warfare metaphor. People come together in some kind of debate, perhaps they even call it a debate, and prepare their arguments and prepare to attack the arguments of the other person. A potential problem there is what constitutes appropriate ammunition. There's no Geneva Convention for this warfare, and the rules which are usually at place in formal debates in the Oxford Union or wherever aren't also usually adhered to or even known about. So what sometimes happens is that ammunition gets brought into that warfare which would not be considered valid, or one side might not consider a valid set of armaments. So, for example, if you and I are in that kind of a discussion, we're having a debate which follows the format of warfare, and I'm trying to destroy your argument so that my argument will stand victorious at the end, what am I allowed to know and say about you in that discussion? If, for example, a simple Google search reveals to me that you have mentioned a mental illness at some point in your history, does that constitute ammunition I can bring into this discussion? Perhaps I've spoken in the past about an unwise sexual liaison. Is that something that you can perhaps bring in an effort to perhaps undermine my credibility? Perhaps you've said something in a previous video, or maybe a Google search would reveal information about perhaps a criminal offence you committed as a teenager. Perhaps you hotwired a car and went joyriding with your friends, and I find out about this. Is it appropriate for me to bring that into the fray as ammunition against you in some way? Or even just to allude to it? Even if I just suggest to you, or you just suggest to me that we know something about one another which could perhaps, under certain circumstances, affect our credibility, is that appropriate ammunition to bring to this particular fight? We're going to feel differently about that, I guess. And of course, the ultimate kinds of ammunition that we can deploy here on YouTube are things like the flag button. Is that an appropriate weapon to deploy at certain points? If I decide that this fight is worth winning at any cost, or if I just decide that your actions have warranted my bringing in of the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, is it okay at that point for me to press a flag button? Or does the Geneva Convention perhaps apply in those kind of terms? I'm going to leave you to think about that, but I would just to remind you what I'm thinking about here is debate as a kind of warfare. The warfare is one of the key metaphors that structures those kind of debates and structures our conceptualization of them. There's quite a lot of literature written about this, but this isn't perhaps the place to cite that. And within that understanding, there are ways of fighting fair and ways of fighting not fair, and maybe we should consider that at some point. And of course, in addition to the warfare metaphor, there are other organising metaphors for discussions. You and I might decide to raise that barn together, or pursue that relay race, or enact some kind of a conceptual choreography together at some point. War isn't the only game we can play. Yeah. Anyway, thanks very much. I'll put links below. I'll also put a text version of this, because I did write this out and then decided I wanted to do it more informally. But I'll put the text version below. Thanks very much.